Benjamin Bunny's brave garden adventure. One sunny morning, the soft trit-trot of hooves echoed along the countryside road. Mr. McGregor, with his stern face, was riding in a gig pulled by a strong little pony. Beside him sat Mrs. McGregor, wearing her finest bonnet. The whole scene felt peaceful, but the animals of the woods knew that this meant something wonderful. Mr. McGregor's garden was now free of humans. As soon as the gig disappeared down the road, little Benjamin Bunny, a lively and curious young rabbit, peered out from the bushes. His ears twitched with excitement. "It's safe now," he whispered to himself. With a quick hop, skip, and jump, he darted across the road and headed straight for the dense woods at the back of Mr. McGregor's enormous garden. The woods were alive with the rustling of leaves and the chatter of birds. This was Benjamin's favorite place, full of hidden treasures and rabbit holes. In the coziest, sandiest burrow of them all lived his aunt, old Mrs. Rabbit, and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter Rabbit. Old Mrs. Rabbit, a clever and industrious widow, earned her living by knitting soft rabbit wool mittens and muffetees for the other animals in the forest. She even sold herbs and rabbit tobacco at the local forest markets. But today, Benjamin wasn't there to visit his aunt. He was on a mission. Bounding over tree roots and hopping through the tall grass, he soon came upon his cousin Peter, sitting all alone beneath a fir tree. Peter looked a bit downcast, and for good reason. He was wrapped up in a red handkerchief, looking rather gloomy. "Peter," Benjamin whispered as he hopped closer. "What happened to your clothes?" Peter sighed and explained the whole story, how he had been chased out of Mr. McGregor's garden, losing his shoes and coat in the process. "They're all on the scarecrow now," Peter muttered sadly, pointing toward the garden in the distance. Benjamin's eyes widened. "Well, don't worry. Mr. and Mrs. McGregor are out for the day," he said confidently. "Let's go get your things back." The two cousins, feeling a bit braver together, climbed up the stone wall at the edge of the garden. From the top, they could see the scarecrow clearly, wearing Peter's blue coat and tiny shoes. "See? I told you," Peter pointed. Benjamin, always full of ideas, said, "The best way in is through the pear tree." And before Peter could protest, Benjamin was already climbing down, jumping from branch to branch. Peter, not as skilled at climbing, slipped and tumbled down headfirst. Luckily, the soft garden soil cushioned his fall, and they both giggled a little, despite the excitement of the moment. Once they reached the scarecrow, Benjamin quickly helped Peter retrieve his shoes and coat. But they weren't in the best condition. The shoes were soggy, and the coat had shrunk from the rain. Benjamin, ever the optimist, shrugged and said, "Let's fill this handkerchief with some vegetables. A little present for Aunt Rabbit." They began picking onions, the scent filling the air as they stuffed the handkerchief to the brim. But as they were busy gathering their loot, Peter began hearing strange noises, rustling and the faintest sound of purring. "I don't like this," Peter whispered, his ears twitching nervously. "Let's go home." But Benjamin, with his carefree attitude, was munching on a lettuce leaf, completely at ease. "It's fine, Peter. I come here with Father all the time. Nothing ever happens." However, Peter wasn't convinced. They hurried through the garden, weaving between flower pots and stacks of old crates. Suddenly, Peter stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes grew wide, and his fur stood on end. There, just around the corner, was the garden cat, sleek, silent, and watching them with piercing green eyes. "Quick! Hide!" whispered Benjamin. In a flash, he pulled Peter under a large basket, covering both of them and their pile of onions. The cat, with a slow stretch, padded over to the basket and sniffed around it curiously. She circled the basket a few times before finally sitting right on top, trapping the two little rabbits inside. Hours passed, and the sun began to sink behind the trees. The weight of the cat on the basket made it impossible for the cousins to escape, and the smell of onions was almost unbearable. They could hear the soft purring of the cat, who seemed perfectly content sitting atop her prize. Just when they thought all hope was lost, they heard a familiar sound, the pitter-patter of small feet. Looking up through the tiny holes in the basket, they saw a figure hopping along the garden wall. It was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny, Benjamin's father, smoking a pipe of lavender and carrying a small switch in his paw. Without hesitation, Mr. Bunny leaped down from the wall and landed right on top of the unsuspecting cat. He gave her a swift cuff with the switch, sending her scurrying off into the greenhouse in a flurry of fur. With the cat safely locked inside the greenhouse, Mr. Bunny lifted the basket and pulled out the two trembling rabbits. He wasn't pleased, though. He grabbed Benjamin by the ears and gave him a good talking to, reminding him of the dangers of sneaking into Mr. McGregor's garden. But despite the scolding, Benjamin and Peter were just happy to be free. They gathered up the onions, marched out of the garden, and headed back home. When they arrived, old Mrs. Rabbit was relieved to see them safe and sound. She forgave Peter for losing his clothes and hung the onions from the ceiling to dry. As the rabbits settled in for the evening, Peter and Benjamin couldn't help but smile. After all, they had survived a great garden adventure and lived to tell the tale.